This is Baxter Colburn, host of the Verse of the Day podcast. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Hey, it's Baxter Colburn here from Public House Media. Did you know that we just added a store here at Public House Media? No, I'm not talking about a grocery store where you can go buy apples or bananas or peanut butter, which are all fantastic, especially when peanut butter's on all of those. Anyway, we've added a store here at Public House Media so you can not only come and represent your favorite podcast network, but also represent your favorite shows as well, too. Just go over to thephmedia.com and look in the top right corner where you'll see the button that says Store. Click on that and you can search through all of our great products. Or if you go to our Facebook page, Public House Media, you can see on the left-hand side a tab that says Store. All of our products are listed there as well, too. It's the new Public House Media store. You don't want to miss it. It is fantastic. Buy some of that great swag to support your favorite shows and to support Public House Media. Check it out today.
Tiana Vanderhei here, host of the Refined Redhead podcast on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast. Once you're done with this episode, you should definitely come check out my show, the Refined Redhead podcast, where we talk to real people about relevant information in hopes of inspiring you to chase after whatever dreams you've set out to accomplish, persevering through whatever obstacles are in your way. A new show comes out bi-weekly every Tuesday, so don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of the Refined Redhead podcast. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. Find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. Poppie is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. If you enjoy How to Write Good, but you don't like the pace of it, or you don't like that it's a little bit disorganized, it's not that disorganized, but there's a difference. Speech is generally more disorganized than written word. You can check out the blog I have on my website. You can also check out How to Write Good on Facebook or Twitter. You can follow How to Write Good on Twitter if you are a tweeter. And this podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. So check them out on Facebook. Just type in Public House Media into the search bar. Or you can look at their website at it's not at the PH. Their website is thephmedia.com. Again, that is thephmedia.com. If you want How to Write Good swag, you can also get How to Write Good swag on Public House Media's website. Since this is the last week of the month, it is the week for a guest. And this week's guest is someone that I found on YouTube, actually. He is an author, and he's put out several different books. You can check out his website at davidvstewart.com, or you can check him out at dvspress.com. So at his website, you can find different things, like things on guitar, so he does stuff like that. And at DVS Press, you can find different things related to what he writes. But I actually found him on YouTube because he does movie and story critiques, and he talks about storytelling and different aspects that make up storytelling. And I thought that was really, really interesting. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce you to David Stewart. All right, David, welcome on the show.
Hi, good to be here.
All right, before we start, I found you on YouTube, actually. And I saw some of your writing. I saw some of your videos that were on. You were assessing different. You were looking at different stories and kind of taking them apart. Can you just, before we start, can you give me a little overview of your background and what you've done and the different areas you're interested in or you're involved in?
I'm a writer. I'm an author. I write books. Predominantly right now in the fantasy genres, but I've written in science fiction as well. I'm also a musician. I put out an instrumental eclectic rock album at the end of 2017, and I run a YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/rpmfidel, where I do film criticism, book criticism, talk about music, talk about writing, generally the stuff that I do,
Okay, all right. So one thing that you talk about that I thought that was interesting is, like, you're going into the different criticisms of stories that are going on in films or different books, and I thought that was interesting, and I thought that you had some interesting things to say about it. So I just wanted to ask you about what you think makes a good story in general, actually.
So there's no one thing that makes a good story. A good story is a story that has an effect on someone. So you really have to start there and work backwards. What tends to make good stories are things that have characters that people have an attachment or a connection with or an understanding of, and the plot that those characters execute has some sort of meaning that's relevant to the people that watch it. So if you're watching something that's kind of extremely trying to avoid that, there was a movie that came out in the 60s called Blue, and I'm trying to remember who did it. He was a famous postmodern painter. There was no plot. It was two people talking to each other for 2 hours, right? And the whole point was to avoid all the things that make a good story. Well, no kidding, that's not going to make a good story. And it's not going to have any kind of good effect because nothing is there designed to have effect. If it has effect, that's incidental. So generally, a good story is something that's going to have an effect on someone, whether it's an effect that makes them happy or sad or mad or upset or makes them think. Those are all different effects, and different stories are going to find ways to execute those effects differently.
So, I just had a question for you. I just completely left my mind. So you're saying that there's no one formula to get a good story, right?
Yeah, there's no one formula. I talk about lots of different tools that you can use, and that's a good way to think about it. Yeah. There's lots of different ways that you can execute it. There's ways that people have done it in the past that work, and that's a good place to start, but it doesn't mean you have to do it any particular way. You can always break the rules or bend them, and usually it's good to at least think about breaking one or two rules in your execution so that there's a little bit of surprise for the reader. Because if it's totally paint by numbers, readers or viewers, if you're creating a movie, they can anticipate how things are going to work. And if they anticipate things too well, then they tend to get bored or annoyed.
Yeah. No, that's kind of like writing in general, I would say, because I've been doing research on writing in general, and you look at it and you have all these different people talking, and you can't really pin down what makes it good. You can have specific principles or rules, but I would agree that you can't just have specific things that, these are the different things that make up a story. But do you think there's certain principles or ideas that if you have them in a story, or they're you're writing something and you are able to, what's the word I'm looking for? You are able to not bring about this principle. You're able to make it happen. So there's a principle you use, and then you work around that principle. Are there any principles that you use when you're telling a story that you kind of have an idea in your head and you're like, okay, I know that most good stories have this, or maybe or a good story needs this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in general, there's three things. I talk about this triangle a lot. Things that have to work together: setting, characters, plot. And if one of those things is not working, then your story is going to suffer. So all setting has to have, all books have to have a clear and understandable setting that creates a set of expectations in the reader. And those expectations are what you're going to use to generate certainty and uncertainty as you execute a plot. Characters have to be created in such a way that they make sense in their setting and they're relatable to the reader, and the character is the one who executes the plot, and those are the things that have to happen. So there has to be a main plot goal. If you're going to look at one thing, all good stories, all stories that really have meaning to the majority of people that you're going to show them to, and there's people who may like stories who have none of this stuff, but if you're planning on making a story that's going to connect with the maximum number of people, there has to be a main plot goal that is setting things up for the reader or for the viewer. So if you look at something probably everybody's seen, which is Star Wars, the plot goal is established essentially in the first scene, which is blow up the Death Star, right? So everything centers around that big piece of conflict. If you don't have a conflict or a direction, and there's a lot of new writers that do this, a lot of pants writers, they're like, well, I just want to write about this character, and they just start writing things, and they try to cook up the conflict as they go. It doesn't usually work out. You probably need to at least start with a conflict or direction. You know where you're heading, so that even if you don't have everything plotted out, your story will work. The reader's going to be like, oh, I wonder how they're gonna get there. If you think of sort of big time pants writers like Stephen King, if you read a series like The Dark Tower, you understand right away like what the main plot goal is. Stephen King kind of loses the plot of the plot goal in the final books, but as a reader, initially you really want to see where things go because you have this distant plot goal in mind, even if it's not clearly, even if the main character isn't clearly defining how he's going to get there or what exactly it's going to look like when he gets to this final goal, which is this Dark Tower.
Yeah, well, in Stephen King, I think Stephen King, he doesn't plan out his stories beforehand, from what I understand. Nope. He kind of just which would make sense
but his
losing the plot. Sorry about that.
Yeah, but most of his stories tend to have like an end goal in mind. And those that didn't have a good one, like The Stand is an example, because The Stand starts with an event, and then he ended up with writer's block because everything kind of, all the characters ended up in a stasis area. They ended up in a place of rest, and there was no final goal, and he had to cook one up. And I still think that's actually a pretty cool book, especially the first half of it is super interesting, and I have a lot of affection for the first act of the book in particular, the first third of the book. But it's a problem if you don't have a good idea of where you're going. Think of Lord of the Rings, right? Like we gotta throw this ring into the fires of Mount Doom, and thus the rest of the story proceeds from there.
Yeah. When you write, what do you do for like planning? Do you kind of have an idea and just write, or do you write everything out?
So I tend to write. I usually start with the setting, like what kind of setting I'm thinking about writing in. So if I'm going to write a fantasy story, I have a fantasy setting that I write in. That I decide, in essence, what the plot goal is going to be, and then I design characters that are going to kind of fulfill that. Mm-hmm. So I start by designing the elements that are going to execute the story, with the main plot goal in mind. So when I wrote Water of Awakening, which is a fantasy book I came out with last year, I knew more or less what the entire story was going to revolve around. It was going to revolve around this quest to get this item to cure this woman's sick husband, right? That's the setup. That's the main conflict. And I created all the characters to fulfill those goals. And then I just wrote down an event sequence. And if you were to look at my document that has my planning document, it just has a series of lines like this happens, this happens, this happens. Helga does this, then she goes here. It turns out this is like this. She meets these characters. They do this. And so there's a couple pages sometimes of event sequence, usually written in just line by line. Sometimes I write it in a paragraph. Depends on how the story kind of comes to me. And then that's what I use to generate the actual entire book. So a 2-page event sequence gets turned into, for me, 100,000 word plus book. Mm-hmm. And for other people, they may have to do more specific things. So they may do scene by scene. This scene, this happens. It depends on how much detail you want to go into. I don't tend to write down scenes. I think of event areas, and if there's multiple scenes that surround that event area, then they are, and I figure out how many scenes or how I'm going to execute them when I'm writing that, because I always write beginning to end. I always write linearly. I can't write non-linearly. And I know some writers that really works out for them, and I'm like, well, try jumping ahead to the next scene where you know what happens. And that tends to work out well for a lot of people, but it doesn't really work out for me. So I tend to write linearly, and that informs what I've done previous, informs what I'm doing in the next event area. And each chapter for me is sort of an event area. So, first chapter, you're at home. Second chapter, you're at the city, the next town over. Third chapter, you escape from the city. Fourth chapter, you're in the, So, and then I have an idea of what happens in each area.
How do you not get writer's block when you're in this specific area? Or do you So you have a specific area. You have a specific, event area is what you called it, right?
Yeah.
So you have the main event. Do you ever run into writer's block when you're trying to flesh out that main event, though?
Not usually.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes I have to stop and really think because it's a complex way to execute it the way I want to. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, I have to back up and redo things because I'm not happy with the execution. But I don't really get writer's block. I think the only time I've really stalled out on writing a book, it wasn't writer's block as much as a loss of faith in the story, where as I'm executing the story, I just decide it's not a good enough story, which makes me not want to continue. Yeah. So you kind of lose confidence in the story. And I've done that a couple times. I have like 3 or 4 books sitting around that I haven't published. I don't know if I'll do the work to publish them because I'm just not convinced that they're very good. So that happens from time to time. And in some cases, a story looks really good in your mind when you're thinking about it, and then you start writing it, and it's a little harder to do, and it doesn't come out the way you want to. You know, sometimes that happens.
It's idealized in your mind, and then when you're trying to actually make it into something real, it doesn't happen in the same way. I understand that. Okay, so you kind of broke up a little bit. I'm going to make sure I got the right information. So you go from setting, you create the setting, you create the plot goal, you create the characters.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. How long does it take you to write a book?
So it depends. I'll usually, because I think of it in 4 phases. And so to go from planning to the final published, it's out online. The last 3 books I did 3 books in 60 days. Really? So I finished the drafting of all 3 books in 40 days. Okay. And that was with a lot of time not spent writing because we had Thanksgiving and all kinds of other things going on. But that's pretty reasonable for me. That was I think I wrote like 2,500 words a day. Yeah. And, that's a really reasonable amount of drafting. Then I designed covers for it. I decided at that point how I was going to volumize it and in what way. I hired an illustrator. I got it out to my alpha readers and beta readers and got feedback and did some revisions. Then I put it out to like my bigger list and kind of did a soft publication, fixed the typos after a couple weeks, and then did a launch of the paperbacks. So I did kind of a weird launch that I tried out with Needle Ash, which is my last series that I did. Mm-hmm. I did 2 books on New Year's Day. And then I did the 3rd book a week later, just because I wasn't ready to put the 3rd book out. I hadn't proofread it or done any of that kind of stuff, and hadn't gotten any kind of feedback from my readers on where the typos were at. 60 days you could do it. I've demonstrated it. I think if I were committed to writing a shorter book, I could easily go from concept to published in 30 days. If the book was less than 50,000 words or less than about 75,000 words, I think you could do it in 30 days if you're really committed to it and if you know how to do all 3 of those phases. What most people do is they get hung up in phase 2, which is drafting. So that's usually because you haven't planned the book very well. Yeah. I could plan a book in 1 day, and then you take a bunch of days to write out all the prose and all the dialogue. And once you get that finished, then it's a lot easier to complete what you're doing in most cases.
Okay. How long did your first book take?
The first book I ever wrote. Is that what you mean? Or do you mean the first book I published?
No, the first book you wrote. Oh, gosh. Okay, that's a hard thing to... Okay, the first...
I'll answer both.
Answer both.
So the very first book I ever wrote, I wrote when I was 19.
Yep.
And I wrote what became the entire book in about a month and a half, writing almost 10,000 words a day. Mm-hmm. And I just wrote as frantically as I could. And I don't know why I did that. I thought it was pretty bad. It was bad enough that I didn't try writing another book for quite some time. Years later, after I decided I wanted to get out of the music business, I wrote some screenplays, and then I decided I wanted to write some novels again. And so the next book I wrote, I wrote 2 books in a row, essentially, and I realized that it was 2 books in a series once I got to about 300,000 words. Mm-hmm. And I wrote those 300,000 words in about 4 months.
Okay.
3 months. And then I tabled that because I still thought the quality was not to where it needed to be, and I needed to do some serious rewriting of the entire story to get the third act to work. And then I wrote another book. That was my first published book, called Muramasa Blood Drinker. I started that. So the entire concept for Muramasa kind of leapt into my head while I was teaching a special ed class in El Segundo, California. Mm-hmm. And I was on a break, and I had this image of a character, and he's following this murder, and then, boom, the plot came from there, and all the characters were just there. Wrote down a quick little plan, and I started writing, and I'm trying to remember, I think I started in March, and I finished in... When did I finish? I'm not sure when I finished. I think I finished in August. So that one took me a little bit longer, and that was because I had to do a ton of research, because it's it's historical fiction.
Yeah. I
really needed to make sure my research was really squared away. So I spent a lot of time doing research. Some of it before I was writing, some of it as I was writing, to get that panned out. And so the more research and world building you have to do ahead of time, the longer it takes to write a book. Water of Awakening I wrote in about 2.5 months, which is a 115,000 word book or so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you must, how do you, I guess I wrote a book in the first initial draft was 4 months, right? So it didn't really take long.
That's really good.
Everything that was going to go on. And that wasn't, I guess that wasn't the first one I wrote. I wrote something else, and it was kind of similar to what you did first. And after I got finished, I'm just like, I'm not keeping this. This is going to go somewhere. It's going to stay there forever. I'm never going to see it again. Maybe I'll use ideas from it, but that's about it. But so I guess that's not that long. It's just a matter of how long you want to revise it and how long you want to think about it, I guess, afterwards.
Yeah. I think Stephen King says, you should a book should take a season. It shouldn't take more than a season, or you're missing the mindset of what creates the book. And there's a truth to that. But I tell a lot of new writers to stick to a more manageable goal, 1,000 words a day or so.
Yeah. Or
just write an hour a day. Because eventually you'll get there. Yeah. And chances are your first manuscript is just not going to be that good. And that's okay. That's good. I'm of the opinion that you need to finish a book. And once you finish it, you'll realize the places where you need to improve for the next one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it's probably the case that you've published a few books too, and you're like, well, now that I'm looking back, there's a lot of things I've actually learned about how to write the book, write better, and how to put stuff together better. I'm sure, because that's kind of the situation I'm in right now, because I'm at the cusp of publishing my first book, and I'm looking back, and I'm like, I'm going to be doing things a lot differently as I go on, as well. Just the learning process, the missteps I took along the way that made it take longer. But yeah, so I was wondering, I guess if you're doing about 2,500 words a day, but how long is your editing process again? Now I'm
it
just
depends.
Interested in this, even though we were talking about storytelling before.
Oh, it depends. Because I'm a good planner, I'm a decent planner. The editing process I can get through pretty quickly. Usually, most people, however long it takes you to draft, you want to have at least half that much time again to edit. So if it takes you 4 months to complete a manuscript, you need to think about 2 months to do editing. And there's a lot of things that need to be fixed, even in a well-written story. With Muramasa, luckily, I only had to cut about 2,000 words. And I didn't, I cut for anything I cut because it was superfluous.
Yeah.
I wrote scenes that I thought they meant something to me, but I look at them at the story and I got to cut them.
Yeah.
So I spent like 6 weeks writing Needle Ash, all 3 books. I spent like 2 weeks doing revisions, and that was during Christmas time and stuff. I really pushed myself to get those done. Probably in the future, I would probably have a little more relaxed revision schedule. And probably for my next books, I'll have a slightly different approach where I'll let the revised manuscript sit around for a while.
Yeah,
just get read by beta readers, and then I'll do more revisions and publish it. Not that beta readers, some people, anyone that hasn't liked one of my books or has had problems with it, there's nothing I could fix in it to make them like it. There's something about the concept that they don't like. Yeah. So Water of Awakening is a classic adventure fantasy novel. It's a journey across space and time. If you don't like that kind of book, there's nothing that I can fix about the book to make you like it. Does that make sense? It's not a modern.
Don't like things.
Yeah, it's not a modern fantasy book. It's a book about adventuring through lots of different fantastical places. So if someone comes back and it's like, well, you should have just had it stay here. I'm like, I'm not going to change that, because that changes the concept of the book. Just not everything's for everyone. It doesn't hurt my feelings if somebody doesn't like the concept of a book that I did.
Yeah. How much do you do a lot of world building or not then? Because if you're writing
I'll do a little bit.
Because I would think that you'd do you feel like if you're writing something so quickly and you're getting it published so quickly too, you're the turnover for how fast you're doing everything is really quick, especially with the Needle Ash stuff, those books. Do you think that your creativity is hampered, or how is that working out then?
What do you mean?
Well, okay, so for me, if I could probably get a book done really, really quickly, but I do tons of planning beforehand. So I have, like you were talking about scenes, and I'll have the details of scenes, and I have the details of the scenes, but they're not really, they're not the most specific things, but they're enough that I can, I know what's going to happen, and I know some details, and then I can get it done because I know what I want. But if I was approaching it from, I guess everybody has their own way of doing things, but if I was approaching it from your process, I would have a 1-page outline, I guess, and then I would go off of that, but then I would feel like I was trying to make stuff up as I was going along. And then I would find myself being like, well, what am I going to do here? So it would slow down my writing, if that makes sense.
So for my fantasy world, the world building I essentially did when I was writing my first books, and I haven't had to do that much more since then. The other thing is you have to think about the things you put in the world. Why are you putting them there?
Yeah.
So are you putting them there because they serve the story, or are you putting them there for some other reason? And those other reasons are not bad. So if you want to have a fleshed out, realistic world, and so if you come up with a world that's so I'm probably going to come out with a couple of books this year that take place in a world where there is no natural light. So it's a world of total darkness, right? And so that when you start there, that creates a whole bunch of different things about how the world works. What generates light? Okay, well they have magic to generate light, right? Because it's a fantasy book and have a magic system for that. And how do they make clothes? Because there's no sun to grow cotton. They make it out of the silk of giant spiders. Oh, that's cool. What a cool solution, So you start coming up with solutions, and it creates a very unique world that creates a setting that people are interested in. Now, the other thing is your world building can serve the plot, meaning, so I need my character to go over some mountains and encounter some ghosts or something, right? So you create a ghost city for them to have some sort of adventure in, right? You build the world to suit the needs of the plot. You can do that as well, versus the other way around. And those two are not, you could do both at the same time. So you can have a pretty well-developed world and create things in it that are special for a particular story. And so that's so anyone that's spending a lot of time on world building, you have to think about what's actually going to affect your plot and your story. And if it's not relevant to a story you're writing, you can think about it later or just admit it. In fact, if somebody asked this question, I think on my YouTube channel just today, it was like, well, how much world building should I do? I'm like, well, if you're thinking about what the farm tools look like and none of your characters are talking to farmers, you're wasting your time.
Yeah. Because it has to, like, if there's something you're using in your, like you're saying, if there's something you're using in your plot that's a detail of the world, then it makes sense to have it show up somewhere. But if it's never going to show up in your plot at all, it's never going to make a difference for what happens in the story, then what's the point of showing the reader that? Yeah.
And the other thing is there's a particular way of executing how you expose a setting in a fantasy novel or in a science fiction novel. And right now, the preferred way to do it is through an indirect kind of exposition. So, you might have a guy say, in fact, I think I used this in a comment. He picked up his sword, shaped like a reverse-edged sickle, a relic of the Badisha Empire and its hatred of straight lines in all forms. Well, you've told a history lesson to the reader, but it's attached to some object which is important in the plot and important to a character. You're not taking paragraphs and paragraphs to describe this fallen empire. You're just giving a hint of it, and that gives some depth to it, and then you move on. If we look at Tolkien as an example, Tolkien did an enormous amount of world building prior to writing even The Hobbit, and did even more prior to writing Lord of the Rings that never really shows up in the books.
Yeah.
However, one of the things you'll notice is everything has a name. Every river has a name.
Yeah.
Every town has a name. Everything has a name, and that gives the reader a sense that the place is real. And that is an effect that is a very good thing to have when you're world building. And that doesn't take a lot of time. They came into the town of Bree, right? Then they did stuff there. It's like they came into a town. What's the name of the town? Bree. It's like they came into Bree. Oh, it's a place. And then he has a couple sentences that describe what Bree is like. Okay, it's a short amount of exposition, but it lends a whole lot of depth to what you're doing. And it also primes the expectations for the reader. And that's the main thing that your world building should do. So let's say, if we look at Brandon Sanderson, I think he did a really interesting world with the Stormlight Archives, which is, you have, rather than east-west, you have Stormward, which is east, and Leeward, which is west. You have a world that is racked by these terrifically destructive storms. And then everything kind of flows from there. So the wildlife is chitinous, insect-like wildlife that can withstand these storms. The grass pulls down into the earth. And then you have to say, well, how does that affect the story? Well, it affects the mindset of all the people that inhabit this world. So they think about things a certain way. Their habits reflect a certain way the seasons happen to work. Their society reflects a certain arrangement that's relative to how the world was constructed and its history, and you drop in the details as the characters are executing a plot, and it really helps to set up the expectations for what's happening. So if he has a society where there's a racial division in terms of eye color, which is I think has been done now by several other people, but if you have brown eyes or black eyes, you're like a lower class citizen. So if the main character is one of these lower class citizens, we have an expectation about what's possible for him, what challenges he's going to face. So anytime he's interacting socially with another person, the reader has a set of expectations that are guiding how they think that interaction can go, and you can surprise them or just fulfill their expectations. And the way that you create a lot of tension is by playing with those expectations. So the quality of world building you do with the setting can play directly into the amount of tension that you have in a story if you've done a really good detailed version of your world, and the plot is also dependent on interactions with that world building.
Okay, I have one more question for you, and then we're out of time, so I'll have to go after that. So, okay, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking about that is how I think it's when you have world building and you just hint at stuff, it can be really powerful. and then you're talking about this idea where you can go you can go too far with world building. So when you're creating a story, how are you developing the world building? Are you doing exposition for it, or are you slipping stuff in like you were talking about before?
So it depends on the story. I've done it both ways. For Water of Awakening, I front-loaded a lot of information. So I front-loaded the information that was necessary to begin the story. And in fact, the whole first chapter is about loading that information up. And then for the rest of the time, it's mostly indirect.
Do you think?
And there's ways. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Do you think that front-loading stuff kind of because the reader has to remember all that as you go through the story? I mean, because if you are slipping it into the story, I think that a reader could remember it better, and then they integrate it into the story as you're going. But if you're I know Tolkien does a lot. Well, he has all his. I think that I don't know. It's been a while
he loads the information. He does direct
front loading as well.
So he does some front loading, but it's pretty minimal, and mine's pretty minimal too. So my front loading is, here's the character, here's what she looks like, here's her history. I'm just going to tell you those things because I don't want to spend time, because it probably saved me 20 pages, 30 pages to tell the reader about the character in the first couple paragraphs, rather than here's a scene of interaction that slightly exposes her past.
Yeah.
The rest of the world building stuff, I just drop it in as you encounter what's relevant. So, hey, here's this place. What is this place? Hey, more knowledgeable character, where are we? Oh, we're over here in this place that I happen to have knowledge of. And then, so the world building happens where where it's relevant to the event. So the reader doesn't have to do a whole lot of remembering back of anything. I think it's a mistake to ask the reader to remember every little detail.
No, yeah, but it would be as well.
But it's okay to set up your world, I think, with a little bit of direct exposition. It's not popular right now. That let me just say that. So it's something that classic writers do and have done in the past. Classic fantasy did this quite a bit, all the way from Tolkien to Robert E. Howard, and there's a lot of front loading at the beginning. Right now, I think it's a mistake to do it. Even though I did it, I do whatever I want to all the time because I'm just like that. But
I think you should if you think the story needs it.
Yeah, and I really didn't want to have like 2 chapters of here's what the characters are, just to compare it to say like Wheel of Time. The first couple chapters of the first book are just characters like talking to each other. They're actually, he does a pretty good job considering how boring that would normally be. Yeah, normally that if they're just like, oh, we're farmers, it's time for a festival, let's interact with each other, and so we can get some indirect exposition of who we are. I kind of wanted to save some time on that, but for the most part, you don't want to spend a lot of time front loading information if you want the reader to keep reading. He's going to get bored. Start with a character.
All right, that's all the time we have. David, thank you for coming on.
And you're most welcome. Thank you for having me on.
All right, that is all we've got for this week. My name is Daniel Poppie, and as always, this is How to Write Good.